Hi guys, why should the next government introduce a wealth tax? One of the arguments against this is that it would be unfair and drive rich people away. This argument is absurd for a number of reasons. However, Britain under the Tories have seen the highest tax burden for decades, but crumbling public services. How is this possible? The reason this paradox exists is due to how things used to belong to the state but are now in private hands. Public services, be them health, infrastructure, housing, used to belong to the state, but it was transferred to the wealthiest in society since the time of Thatcher. The only way to fix this is by taxing the privately owned wealth. Laura Kuenssberg talked about wealth tax with her panel, and unfortunately, some of the old arguments came up.
We need to raise more tax revenue. We absolutely must. And it might surprise people to know that a lot of wealthy people are in favour of paying more tax. And a wealth tax, which has been costed by the Green Party, could raise 70 to 100 billion pounds that could really be spent on projects that would make a difference.
But I think a lot of your viewers might say to you, Hugh, look, the tax burden is at nearly record highs. People are feeling really, really hard up.
I'm not talking about increasing the tax burden on anyone who's having a hard time. I'm talking about what is the point of a Labour government if they can't bring together, narrow the difference between the extremely wealthy and those who are experiencing food and fuel poverty and finding life really difficult? Only a wealth tax will do that.
So Sharon, with your Treasury economist former hat on, if you put that on for a moment, would something like a wealth tax be realistic? Because on the right you get people saying actually that would drive business away, it would have a negative effect, but when you looked at it, I'm sure the Treasury's looked at it over the years, what effect would it have?
So, I mean, with my former hat on, I mean, if I were approaching a spending and tax review after the election, the things that worry you are the tax burden is high and getting higher. There's much less room to tax, but how do you do this in a way that's fair? So I think particularly as both a business person but also a Treasury economist, your worry is you don't want to drive the wealth creators that you need to support growth and support productivity.
Many of those wealth creators are on record as saying they're happy to pay more tax. There's a very interesting organisation called the Patriotic Millionaires. Have a look at their website. There's all sorts of things that could be done to take some of this extreme wealth and narrow the gap between the very rich and the poor in the UK.
Michael, is that something you think is realistic?
No, I think we've heard over the years these suggestions that you only tax the very rich. All these taxes, such as the one that Hugh's recommending, would go far down the ladder. They would hurt not just the very rich, they would hurt ordinary working people who may have been able to save something. They would hit people who save to own their own homes. They would have a disastrous effect on our economy.
Of course, Michael Heseltine, former Tory leader, in to defend the richest in society. Now, you need to have a wealth tax. Let me explain what the big problem here is. If we take something like housing, Margaret Thatcher sold off a huge amount of council houses back in the 1980s under right to buy. Now, right to buy on its own is not a massive problem. But what happened was councils were not allowed to use that extra money to replenish the stock of housing of council houses. So what happened was people bought their council houses. Some people sold them to private landlords who bought up a lot of this stock and turned it into private renting. So people used to rent from the council, or then they were allowed to buy the house. Some people continued to live in those properties. Others sold them to private landlords, and those landlords sold them back or rented them back to people who would have normally relied on council properties or relied on the council. Now, what happened was, of course, the councils were not able to replenish that stock, and you had people requesting housing. People needed housing. So what happened eventually was the councils were having to help people get into properties, but those properties didn't belong to the council. So the council had to give people money in order to top up their rents. So private landlords have these properties, they're making money from that, and the council is helping to pay for that. The state, the taxpayer, is helping people get into properties that those properties used to belong to the state. So when we think about, we can apply this also to healthcare. Doctors, nurses used to be employed by the state. Now, because of shortages or whatever, more and more nurses, for example, are being employed by the private sector. Nurses are being sent from the private sector into the NHS. The NHS is relying more and more on the private sector. This is a cost. Now, in order to cover those costs, well, the government have to raise more money. And how do they raise more money? Through taxes. So the tax burden is increasing, but that money is going directly into the private sector in many cases. So the people in the private sector, the ones who are described as wealth creators, for example, there are landlords with 30, 40, 50 properties. These people are not creating wealth. They're accumulating wealth. So you need to tax those people. You need to take the money back from the private sector and bring it back into the public sector. Because since the 1980s, there's been a massive transfer of wealth from the public sector to the private sector, from the state to wealthy individuals. And those wealthy individuals have made a huge amount of money over the last number of decades and have been able to take advantage of tax loopholes, evasion, avoidance, all of this, and not pay their fair share of tax. And now you have a situation where ordinary people are having to pay more in tax in order to get worse public services, because more of that money is going into the private sector and not into the public sector. Imagine a situation where council houses used to continue to belong to the councils. People would pay their rent, yes, but that money would continue to go back into the coffers of the council. Now what's happening is people are having to rely on private landlords, and the rents are so high that they actually have to ask the council to help them, the state to help them pay their rent. This is the taxpayer transferring money literally directly to the pockets of the landlords. This is why there is a growing tax burden and a crumbling public service sector. The only way to fix that is to claw some of that money back, and you claw that back through a wealth tax. So anyone who's telling you, no, don't go down the road of a wealth tax because that's going to eventually harm ordinary people. Ordinary people are struggling at the moment. Ordinary people are seeing their public services completely collapse. Back in the 1940s, 1950s, President FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, brought in a tax rate of about 90%. I think it was over 90% for the richest in society. And he was able to fund infrastructure, rebuilding the economy after the Second World War, and resulted in a booming economy. The wealth inequality at the time was extremely low. Wealth inequality today is at astronomical levels all over Western Europe and in the West, I should say. So we need to have a wealth tax to claw some of that money back that we transferred to the wealthiest in society over the last number of decades. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.